If you have blue eyes, here's something that should make you stop and think. Every single person on Earth with blue eyes, all 600 to 800 million of them, can trace that trait back to one person, one individual, one genetic accident that happened somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. Not a group of people, not a gradual evolution across different populations. One person, one mutation, and then it spread like wildfire across continents. That shouldn't have happened. See, blue eyes don't actually do anything useful. They don't help you see better. They don't protect you from disease. They don't make you stronger or smarter or more likely to survive a harsh winter. If anything, they're a disadvantage. Blue eyes are more sensitive to bright light. They offer less protection from UV radiation. In the brutal world of prehistoric humans, where every trait mattered for survival, blue eyes should have been weeded out by natural selection before they ever got started. But they weren't. Instead, this completely random genetic glitch spread through ancient human populations with shocking speed. Within just a few thousand years, blue eyes went from not existing at all to becoming common across huge swathes of Europe and Asia. Today, they show up in populations from Scandinavia to the Middle East, from Siberia to the Mediterranean. Why? How does a useless trait, maybe even a harmful one, become so widespread? What was happening in prehistoric Europe that made blue eyes not just survive but thrive? That's the mystery we're unraveling tonight. The story of blue eyes is really a story about human migration, sexual selection, genetic bottlenecks, and the weird accidents that shape who we become as a species. It's about ancient hunter-gatherers moving across frozen landscapes. It's about why certain traits become attractive even when they serve no practical purpose. It's about mythology and culture, and the strange ways humans have interpreted eye colour throughout history. And here's the thing that makes it perfect for falling asleep to. The science is fascinating, but it's also deeply calming. We're talking about changes that happened over thousands of years, slow movements of people across continents, gradual shifts in gene frequencies, the patient accumulation of tiny changes that eventually transform everything. If you're enjoying stories like this about prehistoric mysteries and human origins, we've actually put together a whole book exploring these deep-time secrets. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. But for now, let's stay here in this moment, exploring one of the most beautiful accidents in human history. Because before we can understand why blue eyes spread, we need to understand something even more basic. What exactly are we looking at when we see a blue eye? What is colour, really? And why don't blue eyes actually contain any blue pigment at all? Here's the thing that nobody tells you about blue eyes. They're not actually blue. There's no blue pigment in them. No blue molecules, no blue dye layered into the tissue. If you could somehow extract the iris from a blue-eyed person and grind it up, examine it chemically, you'd find absolutely nothing blue about it. The colour you're seeing doesn't exist in the physical structure of the eye at all. It's an illusion, a trick of physics, light behaving in weird ways, the same thing that makes the sky blue. This is wild when you think about it. Brown eyes. Those are actually brown. There's a pigment called melanin packed densely into the front layer of the iris, and that pigment is genuinely brown. It absorbs certain wavelengths of light and reflects others, just like any coloured object. Same with amber eyes, hazel eyes, even green eyes to some extent. They all contain actual pigments creating actual colours. But blue eyes, they're pulling off something completely different, something that requires understanding a phenomenon called Rayleigh scattering. Here's how it works. Light from the sun or a lamp hits your eye. That light is made up of different wavelengths, different colours, all mixed together. When it enters the iris, it encounters the stroma, which is essentially the structural framework of the iris. The stroma is made of collagen fibres, proteins arranged in a kind of loose, irregular matrix. Not organised, not uniform, just sort of scattered around in there. Now, in a blue eye, there's almost no melanin in the front layer of this stroma. The melanin's all pushed to the back, behind everything, where you can't see it. So when light hits those collagen fibers, something interesting happens. The shorter wavelengths of light, the blues and violets, they're small enough that they bounce off those collagen fibers. They scatter in all directions. The longer wavelengths, the reds and yellows, they're too big. They pass right through the stroma and get absorbed by that melanin layer in the back. What reaches your eye when you look at someone with blue eyes? Only that scattered blue light bouncing back out. The colour isn't in the eye, it's in the light that escapes from it. The sky does exactly the same thing. Sunlight hits Earth's atmosphere, encounters all those nitrogen and oxygen molecules floating around up there, and the blue wavelengths scatter everywhere while the other colours pass through. That's why the sky looks blue during the day and red at sunset. When the light has to travel through more atmosphere, and even the blue wavelengths get scattered away, leaving only the reds. Your eye is a tiny sky, creating colour through physics rather than chemistry. Green eyes are doing something similar but with a twist. They have a little bit of melanin in the front layer of the stroma, not much, just enough to add a yellowish tint. That yellow combines with the blue scattering effect, and your brain interprets the result as green. It's like layering a yellow filter over blue light. Same physics, different outcome. Brown eyes shut the whole thing down. Pack enough melanin into that front layer, and it just absorbs everything. No scattering, no tricks. Just straightforward pigmentation doing what pigment does. But blue eyes are relying entirely on structure, on the spacing between collagen fibers, on the absence of melanin in exactly the right places. Change the density of those fibers even slightly, and the colour shifts. Some blue eyes look almost grey because their collagen structure scatters light just a bit differently. Others look almost violet in certain lighting conditions. This makes blue eyes incredibly rare in the natural world. Most animals that have colour in their bodies, they're using pigments, actual molecules that are actually coloured. Structural colour exists, but it's unusual. You see it in butterfly wings, where microscopic scales create iridescent blues and greens through light interference rather than pigmentation. Morpho butterflies in the rainforest, their wings are actually transparent and brown, but they look electric blue because of how their wing scales are structured. You see it in peacock feathers. Those brilliant blues and greens aren't pigments. They're created by microscopic crystal structures in the feather barbs that scatter light just like the stroma in a blue eye. If you ground up a peacock feather and looked at it under a microscope, you wouldn't find any blue molecules. Bird eggs sometimes use structural colour, so do some fish scales. Certain beetles create metallic colours through microscopic layers that interfere with light waves. But in humans, we're almost entirely pigment-based. Our skin colour, our hair colour, even most eye colours, they all come from melanin doing its straightforward chemical thing. Blue eyes are the exception, the one place where human biology stumbled into the physics trick that butterflies and peacocks have been using for millions of years. And it all happened because of one person. One mutation that broke the melanin production system in exactly the right way. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to turn a human iris into a tiny piece of sky. So who was the person who made this happen? Who was the first human being to look up at their child and see their own eyes reflected back in a colour that shouldn't exist? We know it happened. That's not speculation. In 2008, a team of researchers at the University of Copenhagen, led by a geneticist named Hans Eberg, published something extraordinary. They'd been tracking blue-eye genetics across multiple generations, analysing DNA samples from blue-eyed families in countries as far apart as Jordan, Denmark and Turkey. And they found something that shouldn't be possible if blue eyes had emerged multiple times independently. Every single blue-eyed person they tested carried almost the exact same genetic sequence at one specific location in their DNA. Not similar, not kind of close, nearly identical. The variation between blue-eyed individuals at this genetic location was so minimal that it could only mean one thing. They all inherited it from the same person. One individual, one mutation, one moment in time when brown eyes suddenly became physically impossible in that person's children. The mutation sits right next to a gene called OCA2. This gene is basically the master control for melanin production in your body. It's what determines whether you're going to make a lot of melanin or a little, whether it's going to be dark melanin or lighter melanin, where in your body it's going to be concentrated. Mess with OCA2 directly, and you get serious problems. People with certain OCA2 mutations have albinism, almost no melanin production anywhere in their bodies. They need serious protection from sunlight. Their vision is usually impaired because melanin plays an important role in eye development. But the blue eye mutation doesn't touch OCA2 itself. It hits a different gene called HERC2 that sits right next to it. HERC2 is what geneticists call a regulatory gene. It doesn't make melanin. It controls whether other genes, including OCA2, get turned on or off. The mutation created something like a dimmer switch. It doesn't shut down melanin production entirely. It reduces it specifically in the front layer of the iris during fetal development, while leaving melanin production everywhere else pretty much normal. People with blue eyes still have melanin in their skin, in their hair, in the back layer of their irises. It's just that front layer, that stroma we talked about, where production gets turned way down. This is incredibly precise. You're talking about a regulatory mutation that affects one specific tissue in one specific part of the body during one specific window of development. Evolution doesn't usually work with this kind of surgical precision. Most mutations are sloppy. They break things completely, or they do nothing at all. But this one landed exactly right. It created viable, healthy humans who happen to have structurally different eyes. The Copenhagen team managed to date the mutation by looking at genetic diversity around it. The idea is simple. When a new mutation appears, the DNA sequence immediately surrounding it is identical in everyone who inherits it. But over time, other small mutations accumulate in that surrounding region. The more time passes, the more variation you see. By measuring how much variation exists around the blue eye mutation and comparing it to known mutation rates, you can estimate how long ago it appeared. Their conclusion? Somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. Maybe as recently as the Bronze Age. Maybe as far back as the early Neolithic, when humans were just beginning to figure out agriculture. Geographically, the evidence points to somewhere near the Black Sea, possibly the northwestern region of what we now call the Near East. This fits with other genetic and archaeological data showing major population movements in that region during the Neolithic transition. Think about what this means. 6,000 to 10,000 years ago is nothing in evolutionary terms. The bottleneck that almost destroyed humanity happened 900,000 years ago. Modern humans evolved around 300,000 years ago. We left Africa 60,000 years ago. We'd already built cities, domesticated animals, invented writing by the time blue eyes appeared. The person who first had this mutation was genetically identical to us. They would have spoken a language not too different from ancient forms of languages still spoken today. They probably farmed. They definitely used tools, wore clothes, had a name that their family called them. They weren't some distant ancestor from the evolutionary depths. They were someone who could have sat down at your table and shared a meal. Someone whose life and concerns would have been recognizable, even relatable. And one tiny error in their DNA created something that would eventually spread to hundreds of millions of people. Because here's the thing, that person had children, obviously. and some of those children inherited the mutation, and they had children. And somehow, despite starting from literally zero, despite being a brand new trait in a world where everyone's eyes were brown, this mutation spread. Within 4,000 years, maybe less, it had reached Scandinavia, where it would eventually become dominant. Within 6,000 years, it was showing up in populations from Britain to Central Asia. Today, somewhere between 300 and 500 million people carry it. That's roughly 8% of everyone alive, all descending from one person who lived maybe 8,000 years ago near the Black Sea. There's something philosophically staggering about this. Every blue-eyed person you've ever seen, every blue-eyed face in history, Alexander the Great if the ancient accounts are accurate, Viking warriors, Hollywood actors, your blue-eyed friend from school, they're all connected through an unbroken genetic chain to one individual who experienced something nobody in their family had ever seen before. Their child looked up at them with eyes the colour of the sky, and somehow the world decided to keep that going. For most of human history, everyone's eyes look the same. Not identical, obviously. Individual variation has always existed. Some people had darker irises, some lighter browns, some with flecks of amber or hazel. But the basic palette was consistent. Brown. Dark brown, medium brown, light brown, but fundamentally brown. From the moment anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago until roughly 10,000 years ago, every single person who looked at their reflection in still water saw brown eyes looking back. This wasn't some accident of history. Brown eyes were the default setting because they worked. High melanin concentration in the iris protects against UV damage, particularly important in the intense sunlight of Africa where our species evolved. As modern humans spread out of Africa and into Europe and Asia, they carried those brown eyes with them. For tens of thousands of years, as they adapted to new climates, developed new technologies, survived ice ages and climate shifts, their eyes remained stubbornly, consistently brown. Then, sometime around 8,000 years ago, everything changed. But here's what's strange. When we actually look at ancient DNA from early Europeans, from the people living in Europe during the Mesolithic period right before and after blue eyes appeared, we find something that completely upends our modern assumptions about what those first blue-eyed people looked like. In 1903, workers discovered a skeleton in Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge, England. The individual, nicknamed Cheddar Man, lived roughly 10,000 years ago, right at the boundary between the Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods. For over a century, reconstructions depicted him as light-skinned, fitting our expectations of what ancient Britons should look like. Then, in 2018, researchers managed to extract and sequence his DNA. The results were startling. Cheddar Man almost certainly had blue eyes, but his skin was dark, probably close to the complexion of modern sub-Saharan Africans. His hair was likely dark and curly. He would have looked completely unlike modern Europeans, but he definitely had blue eyes. He wasn't an outlier. La Braña Man, discovered in Spain and dated to about 7,000 years ago, showed the same combination. Blue eyes, dark skin, dark hair. Other Mesolithic hunter-gatherer remains from across Europe tell the same story. These people had been living in Europe for thousands of years, long enough for the blue-eye mutation to appear and spread through their populations, but they hadn't yet developed light skin. This challenges everything we intuitively assume about the package deal of European appearance. We think of pale skin, light hair and blue eyes as evolving together, as a matched set of traits that emerged simultaneously as humans adapted to northern latitudes. But the genetic evidence says something completely different. These traits evolved independently, at different times, driven by different selective pressures. Blue eyes appeared first, for reasons we're still trying to understand. Light skin came later, and probably much more rapidly, driven by pressures we can actually explain. When humans transitioned from hunting and gathering to agriculture, their diets changed dramatically. Hunter-gatherers got plenty of vitamin D from meat and fish, especially organ meats and oily fish. Farmers eating grain-based diets got much less. In northern latitudes with limited sunlight, this created serious vitamin D deficiency problems. Light skin, which produces vitamin D more efficiently with less sunlight exposure, suddenly became a massive survival advantage. Natural selection acted fast. Within maybe 3,000 to 5,000 years, European populations went from nearly universally dark-skinned to predominantly light-skinned. But blue eyes had already been around for thousands of years by then, spreading through populations of dark-skinned hunter-gatherers who roamed the vast forests of Mesolithic Europe. Picture that world for a moment. This is roughly 10,000 years ago, just as the last ice age is ending. The massive ice sheets that covered northern Europe are finally retreating, but slowly. The landscape they leave behind is transforming year by year. Tundra giving way to grassland, grassland being overtaken by birch and pine forests, those evolving into the dense deciduous forests that would dominate Europe for millennia. Small bands of hunter-gatherers move through these forests following game, fishing the rivers, gathering whatever plants the seasons offer. These aren't primitive people struggling to survive. They're sophisticated hunter-gatherers with technologies refined over thousands of years. They have bows, fishing nets, boats, dogs. They understand the landscape intimately, knowing where to find resources in every season, how to predict animal movements, which plants are safe and which will kill you. They're also living among the remnants of the Ice Age megafauna. There are still mammoths in some regions, though they're disappearing. Cave lions prowling the forests, giant deer with antlers spanning 12 feet, aurochs, the massive wild cattle that wouldn't go extinct for another 10,000 years, standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder. And somewhere in this world, probably in the regions near the Black Sea where the evidence points, someone is born with eyes that scatter light instead of absorbing it. Blue eyes in a brown-eyed world. Blue eyes under dark skin framed by dark hair. Their family probably noticed. You'd have to. But whether they thought it beautiful, strange, frightening, or unremarkable, we'll never know. What we know is that it didn't stop them from surviving, from finding partners, from having children who inherited those same light-scattering eyes. And somehow, slowly, those blue eyes began spreading through the small bands of dark-skinned Europeans who had no idea they were about to become the ancestors of hundreds of millions. So here's the real puzzle. If blue eyes began as a single genetic accident in one person, why didn't they just vanish? Most mutations do. In the quiet arithmetic of evolution, random genetic changes are usually either useless or harmful. Harmful ones tend to get wiped out quickly. Neutral ones drift around for a while, flicker through a few lineages, then disappear when a carrier fails to have children or when a small group dies out by chance. Only a tiny fraction ever become common. Yet this one did. The mutation that removes brown pigment from the iris, that turns eyes from dark to blue, spread so widely that today it's found in hundreds of millions of people. In some parts of northern and eastern Europe, the majority of the population carries it. Something had to keep it from fading away. Something, somewhere, was quietly favouring those light-scattering eyes. There are a few suspects. One of the most intriguing is sexual selection. Imagine those Mesolithic forests again. For thousands of years, everyone your ancestors met had brown eyes. Your entire world was made of dark irises reflecting firelight at night and sunlight during the day. Eye contact was familiar, predictable. And then, in one generation, a child is born whose eyes look different. Not just lighter brown, not hazel, different in kind. In daylight, their irises don't drink in the light. They play with it. They seem to glow in a way nothing else in the camp does. In the dim interior of a shelter, they catch even a faint flicker of fire and reflect it strangely. People notice. They can't not notice. Now picture those tiny bands of maybe 20, 30, 40 people scattered across Europe's post-Ice Age woodlands. In a group that small, anything new stands out dramatically. The person with blue eyes is unusual, memorable. The face is easier to pick out across a clearing, across a crowded seasonal gathering, across a riverbank during a meeting with another band. Modern psychology experiments suggest that humans are very sensitive to eye contrast and gaze direction. Light eyes on a darker face make the pupil easier to detect. It becomes simpler to see where someone is looking, whether they're making direct eye contact, whether they're paying attention. In a world where cooperation, trust, and subtle nonverbal communication can be the difference between a successful hunt and a disaster, that might matter. Sexual selection works through preferences, not survival. If, for whatever reason, some people found those unusual eyes appealing, beautiful, mysterious, special, then blue-eyed individuals might have had a small advantage when it came to choosing mates and being chosen in return. Not because they were stronger or faster or healthier, simply because more people wanted to be with them. You don't need everyone in the population to share that preference. You just need enough people, over enough generations, for blue-eyed individuals to have a slightly higher chance of passing on their genes. Even a very small bias, repeated over thousands of years, can amplify a trait dramatically. And then there's the rare advantage idea, which makes this even more interesting. In a world where every eye you've ever seen is brown, a blue eye is not just different, it's rare. Our brains are wired to pay attention to rarity. The unusual fruit on the tree, the unexpected pattern on an animal, the new tool shape no one has seen before. Rarity can create its own magnetism. Anthropologists studying modern societies notice that traits which are uncommon can sometimes become desirable simply because they signal uniqueness. In small, closely connected groups, being distinctive can be a kind of social capital. People remember you. They talk about you. They notice when you're around. In that setting, blue eyes could act like a natural spotlight. The person who has them might seem more intriguing, more noticeable as a potential partner, more likely to be remarked upon in stories, songs, gossip. Even if only a fraction of those impressions translate into actual mating choices, the effect compounds. But sexual selection isn't the only possibility. There's another powerful force in evolution that doesn't care about beauty at all. Genetic drift. Drift is what happens when chance does the work. In a huge population, random fluctuations in gene frequencies tend to smooth out. But in very small populations, the kind humans lived in for most of their history, luck matters. A lot. Take a founder group. Maybe 80 people strike off into a new valley or cross a land bridge or push along a newly opened coastline. Suppose, purely by chance, that 10 of them carry the blue eye mutation. If that group grows and spreads from that small starting base, the traits they happen to carry become common in the descendant population, not because those traits were especially useful, but simply because they were there at the beginning. Over thousands of years, as bands split, move and resettle, these founder effects can play out again and again. A trait that started as a random mutation in one person can become characteristic of an entire region, purely through repeated rounds of drift and founding. This means that, in theory, blue eyes might have become widespread in Northern Europe, even if they were completely neutral, neither helpful nor harmful. They could have piggybacked on the waves of migration and expansion that followed the end of the Ice Age. There's another angle too, one that ties blue eyes into a bigger story about light, latitude, and the chemistry of sunlight in human skin. The vitamin D hypothesis. By the time agriculture took hold in Europe, light skin was under strong selection in northern latitudes. Less sunlight means less ultraviolet radiation, which means less natural vitamin D synthesis in the skin. Populations eating grain-based diets with limited access to vitamin D-rich foods suddenly had a serious problem. Rickets in children, weakened bones, complications in childbirth. Lighter skin, which allows more UV to penetrate and boosts vitamin D production, became a major survival advantage. Natural selection favoured any genetic changes that reduced melanin in the skin. The blue eye mutation itself doesn't directly affect vitamin D synthesis. It changes how pigment is produced in the iris, not in the rest of the body. But genetics is rarely simple. The gene region associated with blue eyes, OCA2/HERC2, sits inside a larger network of genes that influence pigmentation more generally. It's possible, though not definitively proven, that the genomic neighbourhood around the blue eye mutation was riding along with other, more strongly selected changes related to skin and hair. In other words, once northern populations were under pressure to become lighter-skinned for vitamin D reasons, certain chunks of DNA that included the blue eye variant might have been carried along for the ride. Some researchers also wonder if reduced melanin overall, including in the eyes, might have had subtle side effects in low-light environments. Perhaps slightly improved sensitivity to changes in ambient light in long, twilight hours, or altered circadian rhythms at high latitudes with very long summer days and long winter nights. These are speculative ideas, not settled science, but they remind us that traits rarely evolve in isolation. Bodies are integrated systems. Change one piece, and others can be nudged as well. So which of these explanations is right? At this point, no one can say with certainty. The genetic evidence tells us when and roughly where the key mutation arose. It tells us that every blue-eyed person today can trace that colour back to a single ancestor. It shows us how quickly blue eyes became common in certain regions. But it doesn't hand us a neat single-cause story. The most likely answer is that there wasn't one reason. There were many. A rare mutation that happened to be strikingly visible in small, tightly knit bands. Subtle mate preferences that, over thousands of years, gave blue-eyed individuals a tiny reproductive edge. Founder effects and genetic drift scattering that mutation, and sometimes concentrating it as people moved and resettled. Later, broader selection on pigmentation as humans adopted new diets and lifestyles in northern climates, indirectly boosting the frequency of nearby genetic variants. Layer upon layer, no grand plan, just the tangled, slow, half-blind creativity of evolution, working with whatever material history happened to provide. What matters for our story is this. Blue eyes were never guaranteed. They could easily have vanished with one unlucky generation, one hunting accident, one epidemic in a small camp beside a river that no longer exists. But they didn't. They persisted. They spread. They hitched rides on migrations, on marriages, on the quiet choices of who sat a little closer to whom when the nights were cold and the fires burned low. And as humans kept moving, out of the forests of Mesolithic Europe, into new lands, new cultures, new myths, those pale eyes went with them, carrying their improbable history into a wider world. The blue eye mutation didn't stay put. It couldn't. Humans don't. From the moment our species emerged, we've been moving, following herds, chasing seasons, drifting along rivers and coastlines, pushing into new valleys and new shores, and once that tiny change in the OCA2/HERC2 region existed, Once it had survived those early generations in scattered Mesolithic bands, it began to ride those movements like a passenger. To trace its journey, we have to follow 3 great waves of people across the map of the Old World. The first wave belongs to the last true hunter-gatherers of Europe. Mesolithic Europe was a mosaic of forests, rivers and coasts, gradually thawing from the grip of the Ice Age. Glaciers retreated north. Tundra turned to woodland. Lakes formed in the footprints of melting ice sheets. Across this changing landscape, small groups of hunter-gatherers moved with the seasons, exploiting rich fishing grounds, tracking red deer and wild boar, gathering nuts and berries. We now know, from ancient DNA taken from their bones, that many of these Mesolithic Europeans had dark skin, dark hair, and surprisingly often, blue eyes. It's a combination that would look unusual to us today, because in the modern world we tend to associate light eyes with light skin. But evolution doesn't care about our associations. The blue-eye mutation spread through these early foragers long before the strong selection for pale skin in northern Europe had fully kicked in. Generation after generation, as bands split and moved, as some settled around rich river valleys and others hugged the coasts, that single ancestral variant drifted with them. It showed up in a child born in what is now Spain, another in what is now Luxembourg, another by a lake that would one day be called Karelia. Most of Europe at this time was still relatively empty by modern standards. Human densities were low, but that made founder effects even more powerful. Any time a small group pushed into new territory, crossing a mountain pass, following salmon upriver, skirting the edge of a receding glacier, the genes they carried became the genetic baseline in that new region. Sometimes those groups didn't make it. Sometimes they vanished, and whatever version of the gene pool they represented vanished with them. Other times they flourished, and slowly, unevenly, the blue-eye variant threaded itself through the tapestry of Mesolithic Europe, never universal, but never disappearing. Then came people who changed everything. The second wave wasn't made of roving foragers, but of farmers, Neolithic communities descending from the first agricultural societies of Anatolia, in what is now Turkey and its surroundings. Around 9,000 years ago, some of the most radical experiments in human history were underway there. Wild grasses were being tended, then domesticated. Goats and sheep were being corralled, bred, and reshaped by human preference. Small villages appeared, clusters of houses, storage pits, granaries, shared walls, and shared risks. Agriculture didn't just produce more food, it produced new kinds of societies, larger, denser populations, more children surviving to adulthood, permanent settlements where people could meet, trade, and intermarry with neighbouring groups more regularly. Entire regions knit together by shared crops, shared tools, shared ways of living. Genetically, this mattered. In a tiny band of foragers, a rare trait can vanish simply because a few unlucky carriers don't have surviving children. In a village of a few hundred, linked into a broader network of thousands across a region, that same trait has a much better chance of persisting and of spreading. As Anatolian farmers began to push into Europe, moving along the Danube valleys, crossing the Aegean in simple boats, creeping up through the Balkans, they brought with them not just wheat, barley and livestock, but their own genetic signatures, darker eyes, different pigmentation patterns, new immune system variants. For a time, the continent held 2 very different populations living side by side. Hunter-gatherers, with some blue eyes among them, living in familiar forests and coasts. Farmers, mostly brown-eyed, arriving with ceramics, domesticated animals, and an entirely new relationship to the land. They didn't just glare at each other from opposite sides of a valley. They interacted. They exchanged goods, knowledge, and eventually genes. In many places, the farmer's way of life gradually took over, simply because it could support more people. Fields replaced wild meadows, forests were cleared, villages multiplied. But those old Mesolithic lineages didn't vanish completely. Ancient DNA tells us that in some regions, especially in northern and western Europe, hunter-gatherer ancestry remained woven into the population for thousands of years. With it, the blue-eye mutation slipped quietly into these growing Neolithic communities, now backed by the numbers and stability to help it persist and expand. And then a third wave arrived, riding horses across the grasslands. Around 5,000 years ago, a group of pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe north of the Black and Caspian Seas began one of the most consequential journeys in human history. Archaeologists call them the Yamnaya. They lived in wide, open landscapes where the horizon felt endless. Their wealth was measured in livestock. They buried their dead in earthen mounds, kurgans, scattered like low hills across the steppe. They had wagons, harnessed animals, and perhaps more importantly, an emerging culture of mobility. The Yamnaya didn't invade Europe in a single sudden event. It was more like a series of pulses, clans pushing outward to find new pastures, groups marrying into local communities, wagons creaking along river valleys, horsemen scouting ahead. Over centuries their descendants spread across vast stretches of Europe, from the plains of Hungary to the forests of Germany and beyond. Their genetic legacy is so strong that many modern Europeans carry a substantial proportion of Yamnaya ancestry. Linguists even think that many Indo-European languages, English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, ultimately trace back to dialects spoken by people linked to these steppe herders. What did this have to do with blue eyes? Ancient DNA suggests that Yamnaya-related populations carried both light skin and light eye variants at appreciable frequencies. When they mingled with the existing Neolithic farmers and residual hunter-gatherer groups, they didn't just bring new languages and technologies, they reshaped the genetic landscape of the continent. In some regions, especially in the north and northeast, the combination of Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry, Neolithic farmer ancestry, and Yamnaya steppe ancestry created a particular cocktail of pigmentation genes. Blue-eye variants became more common, so did variants for lighter skin, and eventually lighter hair. Over time, these traits reached some of their highest frequencies in places like Scandinavia, the Baltic, and the northern British Isles. Think of the long coasts of Norway and Sweden, where fishing villages clung to fjords and people depended on marine diets rich in vitamin D. Think of the islands of the Baltic Sea, trading hubs between east and west. Think of the damp, misty hills of Scotland and Ireland, fringed by cold Atlantic waters. In these regions, repeated founder events, relative isolation, and the particular mix of ancestral populations amplified the blue-eye variant. Small coastal communities separated by forests or water from their neighbours could drift genetically in their own direction. A few lineages carrying the mutation could, over centuries, become the majority. By the time written history glanced northward from the Mediterranean, travellers were already remarking on the striking light eyes and hair of some northern peoples. But those observations were only the surface of a process that had been unfolding quietly for millennia. And blue eyes didn't stay confined to the far north. They show up surprisingly in other places too. Among some Berber groups in North Africa, where oral histories and genetic evidence alike hint at ancient connections across the Mediterranean, Phoenician traders, Roman colonists, medieval movements, and perhaps even older exchanges with peoples from southern Europe. In pockets of the Middle East, where millennia of empire, trade and conquest mixed people from Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Levant and beyond. In parts of Afghanistan and Central Asia, crossroads of the Silk Roads, where migrations from the steppe, from Persia, from South Asia, and from further west intersected again and again. In all these regions, you can still occasionally meet someone whose eyes carry that same ancient signature. Light scattering through a pigment-poor iris, revealing the grey-blue of structural colour rather than the depth of melanin. Not because they're from Europe in any simple modern sense, but because deep in their ancestry, threads connect back to the same ancient sources: Mesolithic foragers, Neolithic farmers, steppe pastoralists, people who moved, met and had children long before borders and nations existed. Blue eyes are a reminder that human history is not neat lines on a map. It's overlapping waves, hunter-gatherers in quiet forests, farmers building the first villages, horse riders crossing grass seas under huge skies. Each wave carried genes forward. Some faded away. Others, like that single mutation in OCA2/HERC2, survived every turn in the road. From Anatolian plains to European river valleys, from the Black Sea steppe to Baltic shores, from North African mountains to Central Asian passes, those pale eyes kept travelling, glimpsed briefly in countless lives, closing each night, opening each morning, looking out at new landscapes under the same old sun. By the time blue eyes had threaded their way through these wandering populations and settled into higher frequencies in the north, people weren't just noticing them as a physical quirk. They were starting to tell stories about them. Imagine you're a trader from the Mediterranean world, used to faces framed by dark hair, dark brows, dark eyes. You step off a creaking boat in some cold northern harbour. The wind bites. The light feels strange, paler, thinner, reflected off water and snow. And someone looks back at you with eyes the colour of the sky. In a world without genetics, without an understanding of melanin or structural colour, that doesn't feel like biology. It feels like symbolism, like a message. So humans did what humans always do. They wove it into myth. In the north, among the people who would one day be called Norse, the highest gods were skywalkers and stormbringers. Odin, the Allfather, sat on his high seat in Asgard and watched the worlds. He sacrificed an eye at Mimir's well in exchange for wisdom, trading vision in the ordinary sense for sight in a deeper, stranger one. The myths don't freeze his eye colour for us the way modern fantasy art does, but later traditions and medieval descriptions often imagined gods and heroes with pale, shining eyes that reflected the cold northern sky, the winter sea, the colour of ice under cloud. When you live in a place where blue and grey dominate the horizon, it isn't hard to see why a person whose eyes mirror that landscape might feel uncanny. Like they carry a piece of the sky in their skull, like they see more than they should. That association between upward, airy realms and light-coloured eyes shows up again and again. Across Indo-European mythologies, the great gods of the sky and thunder, Zeus, Jupiter, Indra, Perun, are linked, not just to lightning and storms, but to clarity, vision, oversight. Even where eye colour isn't specified, the idea that the heavens watch, that they keep an eye on human affairs, is everywhere. In some later European folk traditions, people with blue or very light eyes were said to have a special knack for seeing spirits, reading omens, or seeing through lies. Their gaze could bless or harm, and that duality, eyes as both protective and dangerous, wasn't limited to the north. Turn south to the Nile. Ancient Egypt gave the world one of the most enduring eye symbols in history, the Eye of Horus. It wasn't blue in their original conception. It didn't need to be. What mattered was the idea of an eye as a vessel of power. Horus's eye is wounded in his battle with Set, then restored. It becomes a symbol of protection, healing, and divine surveillance. It warded off harm when painted on boats, carved on amulets, set into tombs. But Egypt wasn't sealed off from the rest of the Mediterranean. It was part of a web of trade, war, and exchange that included peoples with a wider range of eye colours: Libyans to the west, Levantine sailors to the east, Aegean visitors from across the sea. Later depictions from the broader region sometimes shade divine or royal eyes with blue pigment, not to document literal iris colour, but to link the gaze with lapis lazuli, with the sea, with the sky. Blue was costly. Lapis came from far-off mountains. To give a statue or painting blue in its eyes was to invest it with distance, with otherworldliness. Around the eastern Mediterranean, another idea also emerged and hardened, that a strong, unusual gaze could harm as well as help. The evil eye isn't a single belief, but a family of fears and practices stretching from Egypt and Greece through the Levant, Anatolia, North Africa, and eventually much further. The basic thought: certain people, often those who stand out by beauty, by status, by strangeness, can unintentionally or intentionally curse with a glance. Their envy, their intensity, their sheer difference leaks out through the eyes. In some traditions, particularly later Greek and Middle Eastern ones, pale or light-coloured eyes, blue, grey, very light green, were occasionally singled out as especially potent, especially risky. Not universally, not always, but enough that you start to see a pattern. What is rare becomes charged. What's uncommon in a local population becomes spiritualized. So people responded the way they always do when they feel surrounded by invisible threats. They turned the symbol back on itself. They made blue-eyed charms, little glass amulets with concentric circles of white and dark and bright blue, staring out like stylized irises. Nazar Bonkü in Turkish, Mati in Greek, suspended over doorways, pinned to collars, hanging from rear-view mirrors in modern cars, an eye to watch the watching eyes, a gaze to turn away the dangerous gaze. It's a strange loop when you think about it. Perhaps in some places, actual blue or light eyes were feared as uncanny, and then stylized blue eyes became the universal protector against that very fear. Meanwhile, further west, in the literary world of ancient Greece and Rome, eyes were being described in a different but equally revealing way. If you open Homer and look for eye colour, you don't find the neat categories we use now. No one is blue-eyed in the modern sense. Instead, you meet Athena, glaucopis, traditionally translated as grey-eyed or bright-eyed. The word glaucos is slippery. It can mean gleaming, flashing, pale, bluish-green, grey, like the surface of the sea under a certain light, or the sheen on an owl's feathers. To call a goddess glaucopis isn't to say she has Pantone-certified grey irises. It's to say her eyes are sharp, luminous, unsettling, not like ordinary human eyes. Ancient colour terminology wasn't about strict wavelengths the way ours is. It was about quality, brightness, depth, matte or glossy, alive or dull. When poets called the sea wine dark, they weren't colour-blind. They were reaching for a felt comparison, the way light sinks into a stormy ocean the way it does into a cup of red wine. So when Greek or Roman authors occasionally mention eyes that are glaucos, or kyanios, dark blue, or melas, black, they're telling us less about exact pigmentation and more about how those eyes struck them. Hard, soft, deep, cold, shining. But underneath that, something else emerges, an awareness that eyes differ, that some are light and some are dark, and that those differences map onto character, mood, even divinity. Light, flashing eyes belong to goddesses of wisdom and war. Deep, dark eyes belong to heroes whose passions run hot. Clouded eyes signal death, or madness, or seer-like distance. And beyond the Mediterranean, on roads where languages changed every few days and caravans crept slowly across deserts and steppes, eye colour became a kind of shorthand for entire peoples. Chinese chroniclers described distant western tribes with hair like fire and eyes like the sky. Roman writers talked about Gauls and Germans with terrible bright eyes. reflecting not just their physical appearance but Roman anxieties about northern ferocity. Later Arabic geographers and historians, encountering Slavic, Turkic or steppe peoples, sometimes remarked on their pale eyes as one more sign that they were ajnabi, strangers, outsiders, others. None of these observers knew anything about the OCA2/HERC2 region, about Mesolithic foragers, about Yamnaya herders riding out under broad skies. They only knew that some faces looked familiar and some did not, that some gazes blended into the crowd and some cut across it. So they turned those differences into stories. Sometimes stories of wonder, blue-eyed barbarians as giants, as almost mythical, as fierce children of the cold. Sometimes stories of glamour, pale-eyed foreigners imagined as exotic, erotic, magnetic. Sometimes stories of suspicion, eyes that did not look like ours, were eyes to be watched, managed, distrusted. In all of this, blue eyes, and other light eyes, were slowly being loaded with meaning far beyond anything encoded in the DNA itself. They were becoming symbols, symbols of the sky and the sea, of gods who watched and judged, of spirits who protected or cursed, of foreigners at the edge of the known world, of beauty, of danger, of otherness. Those meanings didn't stay locked in scrolls and amulets. They lingered, drifting down through folklore and religion, through medieval chronicles and Renaissance portraits, into the modern era. And in time, some of those old associations, sky-coloured eyes as signs of divine favour or as markers of a special, separate people, would be twisted into something darker, turned from myth and poetry into ideology and hierarchy. The same trait that once made travellers whisper about eyes of the gods would, in some hands, become a supposed proof of superiority. That turning is where our story goes next. By the time Europe and its colonies slid into the 19th century, those old stories about strange eyes at the edge of the world hadn't vanished. They had just changed costumes. The age of myth faded into the age of measurement. Telescopes, microscopes, careful lists of plants and animals. People started classifying everything, from beetles and birds to skull shapes and skin tones. The urge to sort and rank that had once belonged to gods and heroes moved into lecture halls and laboratories, and into that new world, eye colour quietly followed. Doctors and naturalists began noting that some regions seemed to have more light eyes, others more dark. They drew maps, they took measurements, they tried to fit a gradient of human faces into tidy boxes called races. Some of this was genuine curiosity, some of it was naked politics, much of it, in hindsight, was pseudoscience dressed up in Latin. Writers like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, Arthur de Gobineau, and later a whole crowd of race theorists began taking simple observations. These people often have lighter eyes, those people often have darker eyes, and inflating them into grand hierarchies. Light skin, light hair, light eyes were quietly, then loudly, associated with intelligence, self-control, civilization. Darker features were pushed down the invented ladder. None of this was grounded in genetics. Genetics as we know it didn't even exist yet. Gregor Mendel was still quietly counting peas in a monastery garden, but it didn't matter. The story was too useful. Industrial empires needed a way to explain and excuse conquest, slavery, and extraction. So, race science supplied it. Phrenologists measured skull bumps. Anthropometrists catalogued nose angles and brow ridges. Eye colour slipped easily into this schema as one more alleged sign of inner worth. Light eyes became, in some European writings, a shorthand for northern, Teutonic, masterful. Dark eyes for southern, oriental, primitive. These words weren't neutral. They were soaked in value judgments. The gaze that had once been seen as uncanny or divine was being recast as a marker of supposed biological destiny. By the early 20th century, this thinking hardened into something even more dangerous: eugenics. Eugenics took the language of heredity, stripped it of nuance and turned it into a program. If traits were inherited, the argument went, then societies could improve themselves by encouraging the right people to reproduce and discouraging, or forcibly preventing, the wrong people from doing so. In the United States, Britain, Germany, the Nordic countries, and elsewhere, eugenicists wrote pamphlets and laws. They drew charts of desirable and undesirable traits. Poverty, disability, mental illness, criminality, all were blamed on blood, not on social conditions. And running like a pale thread through many of these charts were physical features: skin tone, hair texture, eye colour. Not every eugenicist fixated on blue eyes, but in Northern Europe and North America they frequently appeared as part of the ideal type. Posters and propaganda imagery often showed wholesome, rosy-cheeked children with fair hair and light eyes as the visual embodiment of the nation's future. Darker-featured children, when they appeared at all, were cast as warnings. Then, in Germany, this loose cluster of prejudices, myths, and pseudoscience crystallized into something harsher. Nazism took 19th century race theory, early 20th century eugenics, and centuries of religious and ethnic bigotry, and fused them into an ideology obsessed with purity. They called their desired template the Aryan, or Nordic, type: tall, strong, fair-haired, light-eyed. In reality, actual Germans came in every shade of hair and eye imaginable, but the symbol was powerful. In posters, films, school books, the ideal German was often shown with blue eyes. Children in Nazi youth organizations were sorted, measured, photographed. Race examiners looked at skulls, noses, and yes, irises, trying to categorize people into invented sub-races. It didn't matter that many Nazis themselves didn't fit the fantasy. It didn't matter that leading party members had brown eyes, or that Hitler himself did. The point wasn't accuracy. It was mythology with uniforms. Blue eyes became, in this propaganda, a sort of visual password, a quick, obvious sign that someone might belong to the imagined in-group. Jews, Roma, slaves, and countless others were cast as fundamentally other, regardless of their actual appearance. But when they did happen to have light eyes, it only underlined the absurdity of the categories. Real genetics, when it finally emerged as a rigorous science, never supported any of this. But the ideology didn't wait for data. Race laws were written, people were sterilized, families were broken apart, millions were murdered. And somewhere in that bureaucratic machinery of horror, eye colour, this delicate scattering of light through layers of tissue, was being recorded on forms and files, weighed as evidence for or against someone's right to belong, to live. After the war, when the full extent of Nazi crimes became known, the word eugenics curdled. Overt race science lost its respectability, but the ideas didn't evaporate overnight. They lingered in subtler assumptions, in beauty standards, in jokes about good genes, in unspoken hierarchies of whose features were praised and whose were pathologized. Modern genetics, when it finally caught up with the questions people had been asking all along, told a very different story. Instead of tidy, separate races, it revealed gradients and overlaps. Most human genetic variation sits within populations, not between them. Two people from the same village can be more different genetically than one of them is from someone on another continent. Eye colour turned out to be a perfect illustration of this. Blue eyes do not belong to a single race. They never did. That original mutation in the OCA2/HERC2 region likely arose in a single individual somewhere around the Black Sea region, or its broader neighbourhood, long after modern humans had already spread widely. From there, carriers moved. They intermarried, They had children. Those children moved again. The variant rose in frequency in some places, stayed rare in others, drifted, spread, mixed. Today, you can find blue or very light eyes in people who identify as Northern European, of course, but also among some populations in the Middle East, in parts of North Africa, in Central and South Asia, scattered through the Americas via colonization and migration, appearing unexpectedly in families whose recent ancestors mostly had dark eyes. You can even find traces of the same ancestral variant in people whose eyes look dark at a glance, but reveal rings of grey or hazel in certain light. The boundary isn't neat. It never was. Genetically, blue eyes are a story of sharing, not separation. They're a record of gene flow, of groups meeting, marrying, trading, having children. The fact that this one mutation shows up in so many different ethnic and cultural contexts is evidence not of isolation, but of connection. That's the irony. The very trait that was once held up as proof of purity is in reality a living archive of mixture, of ancient wanderers crossing rivers and mountains, of villages visited, alliances made, strangers welcomed in. When you look at a pale iris and think northern, you're seeing only a thin slice of its history. That colour is the end point, for now, of thousands of journeys your eyes can't trace unaided. Which brings us to a quiet responsibility. We live at a time when we can peer into DNA, map ancestry, trace mutations back tens of thousands of years. We know, better than any generation before us, how shallow the visible differences between humans really are, and how deep our shared origins run. But knowledge doesn't automatically prevent misuse. The same curiosity that leads someone to send off a spit sample for a genealogy test can, in darker moods and movements, be twisted back toward old obsessions. Who is pure? Who belongs? Whose traits are better? So the task isn't just to understand genetics, it's to hold that understanding in the right frame, to remember that beauty, a particular eye colour, a particular pattern of freckles, a particular curl of hair, is not a rank or a badge. It is an outcome of chance, history, environment, and the quiet arithmetic of inheritance. It says nothing on its own about worth, about kindness, about capacity. Blue eyes feel special because they're relatively rare globally, because they catch the light in a certain way, because cultures have layered them with meaning for thousands of years. All of that is real on the level of experience. It shapes art, attraction, stories. But as a biological fact, they are simply one more variation in how humans can be human. If there is anything like magic in them, it isn't in the melanin or the lack of it. It's in the invisible web of migrations, encounters, and loves that had to happen in exactly the right sequence for that particular shade to appear in that particular person. Now, understanding that doesn't make the colour less beautiful. It makes it more so. And it opens the door to another question, one people have been quietly asking for a long time, in poems and whispers and glances. Why do we find certain eyes so captivating in the first place? Why does a flash of blue or green or deep brown feel like it can stop time? To answer that, we have to leave history for a moment and step into a different kind of inquiry, the science of attraction. The first thing to say is almost disappointingly simple. When psychologists actually sit people down, show them faces and ask, which one do you find more attractive? The answers are messy. In some studies, especially those done in Northern and Central Europe, participants show a slight preference for lighter eyes. In others, there's no clear winner. Sometimes brown-eyed faces are rated as warmer, more trustworthy. Sometimes blue or green eyes get a tiny bump on uniqueness or beauty. And in many parts of the world, when similar tests are run, eye colour barely registers as a factor at all compared to things like facial symmetry, expression, or even hairstyle. So if there is any universal law of attraction written in our eyes, science hasn't found it yet. What the data do suggest instead is something subtler. We tend to like what looks familiar, or what looks slightly unusual against a familiar background. In regions where most people have dark eyes, lighter eyes can seem exotic, rare, worth a second glance. In regions where light eyes are common, it's often the deep browns or unusual mixes, hazel with golden flecks, grey with a dark ring, that stand out. Culture sits on top of this like a weight. Children grow up surrounded by faces, by love, by stories, by screens. They see which faces get praised in movies, which are called beautiful at the dinner table, which are drawn as heroes in school books. Over time, those patterns sink in. So part of why anyone, anywhere, thinks a particular eye colour is attractive is simply that they have been told in 1,000 quiet ways that it is. But there might be more going on beneath the surface, literally, in the surface of the eye. Look closely at an iris, any iris, and you'll notice something. The pupil in the centre is always black. That's the opening, the hole that lets light into the eye. Your pupils dilate and constrict all day long, adjusting to brightness, but they also respond to emotions. Fear, interest, arousal, concentration, all can cause subtle changes in pupil size. You can't control it consciously. You can't fake it on demand. That makes the pupil one of the most honest signals your body has. Some researchers think our brains have learned over millions of social interactions to read that signal without us ever realizing it. A slightly enlarged pupil might register in some deep pre-verbal part of the mind as, this person is interested, this person is engaged, this person might like me. Here's where eye colour comes in. On a dark iris, it's harder to see fine changes in pupil size, especially at a distance or in dim light. On a light iris, blue, grey, green, the black circle stands out more starkly. Tiny variations become more noticeable. This has led to the pupil detection theory of eye colour and attraction. The idea that, for social animals like us, being able to read each other's internal states accurately is hugely valuable. If light eyes make that reading easier, even a little bit, they could carry a small advantage in context where trust, cooperation, or mating decisions matter. Imagine two strangers meeting by a fire 15,000 years ago. They don't share a language yet. They share a hunt, a meal, glances across the flickering light. One can see that the other's pupils widen in sync with their own laughter, their own stories. That synchrony feels like connection. Now, to be clear, this is a hypothesis, not a settled fact. Studies have found that people can detect pupil changes in both light and dark eyes, especially up close. And attraction is influenced by so many variables that isolating one tiny cue is difficult. But the possibility itself is intriguing. That part of what draws us to certain eyes isn't the colour in the usual sense, but the way that colour frames the truth of someone's gaze. There is another theory, more specific and more controversial, that circles around blue eyes in particular. It starts with a simple genetic observation. Blue eyes, in most cases, result from recessive variants in a handful of genes. Two parents with very little melanin in their irises are, statistically, more likely to have children with similarly light eyes. Two parents with bright blue eyes will rarely have a child with very dark eyes, unless there's additional variation in play. From this, some researchers have proposed what's been called the paternity certainty hypothesis. The idea goes like this. In populations where blue eyes were rare, a blue-eyed man might prefer a blue-eyed partner because any resulting children with non-blue eyes would stand out more obviously as biologically suspect. If his mate had a different coloured eye, and the child did too, it would be harder, under a simple folk genetics, to tell who contributed what. In this story, blue-eyed men are not just attracted to blue eyes because they think they're pretty. They are unconsciously making a calculation about future certainty. If she shares my rare trait, I'll be more confident the child is mine. Some lab studies have found that blue-eyed male participants do in fact rate blue-eyed female faces as slightly more attractive than brown-eyed ones, more so than brown-eyed men do. At first glance, that seems to support the hypothesis, but there are problems. Modern people are not Paleolithic villagers. Our preferences are steeped in film, fashion, and personal experience. Light eyes have been glamorized in European and American media for generations. Blue-eyed men and women might simply be internalizing narratives that say, people who look like you and like your family are beautiful. Beyond that, paternity is influenced by 1,000 social and emotional factors, not just iris color, and real-world data on mating, cheating, and reproduction do not show clear patterns that would definitively support this kind of single-trait evolutionary story. So most scientists treat the paternity certainty hypothesis as an interesting possibility, not a demonstrated engine of human behavior, a thought experiment more than a verdict. While these theories swirl in academic journals, something very concrete has been happening in the world outside the lab, the global export of a particular beauty script. Throughout the 20th century, American and European films spread across the planet. Magazine covers, fashion shoots, pop stars and models appeared in cities far from where they were photographed. And disproportionately often, especially in earlier decades, those faces had light eyes. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was a feedback loop. Directors and advertisers in majority European societies chose what they thought looked striking or glamorous. Audiences got used to seeing those faces at the center of stories. Other industries imitated the look. Soon, in places where blue eyes were vanishingly rare, they were still the ones most often associated with wealth, fantasy, or dream lives. Camera lenses and lighting techniques added to the effect, making pale irises seem almost luminous on black and white film. Color photography exaggerated the contrast. As this imagery spread, so did its underlying message, that certain eye colors were special, desirable, worth imitating. You can see the echo of that message today in one of the most quietly booming corners of the beauty industry, colored contact lenses. In Seoul and Tokyo, in Lagos and Sao Paulo, in online shops that ship anywhere, you can buy lenses that turn dark irises into honey gold, jade green, storm grey, ice blue. Some are subtle, designed to make the iris look just a little larger, a little brighter. Others are theatrical, transforming the eye into something almost otherworldly. People wear them for cosplay, for weddings, for nights out, for selfies. Sometimes just to see what it would feel like to look in the mirror and have the world reflected back in a different shade. The popularity of these lenses doesn't prove that one color is better. If anything, it shows the opposite. We are fascinated by change itself, by the idea that something so central to our sense of self, our gaze, can be swapped, experimented with, like trying on a different mood. Underneath all the theories and industries, though, is a quieter complexity. When anthropologists and psychologists look across cultures, they find enormous variation in what people say they prefer. In some societies, dark eyes are associated with depth and seriousness, light eyes with coldness or unpredictability. In others, pale eyes are linked with romance and mystery, dark eyes with strength and reliability. Some communities have no strong opinions about colour at all, focusing instead on the expressiveness of the gaze, how someone looks at you, rather than the pigment around the pupil. The more carefully you listen to people talk about attraction, the more slippery eye colour becomes as an isolated factor. A person might say, "I love blue eyes," but when pressed, what they often mean is, "I love the way they looked on this specific person I once knew, the way they lit up when they laughed, the way they caught the sunset on a particular day." We're back again to individuals, to memories, to context. So when you hear claims, whether in pop psychology or casual conversation, that humans naturally prefer one eye colour over another, it's worth holding that with a gentle skepticism. We're drawn to eyes because they are how we see the mind behind the face. The colour is part of that, a frame, a texture, a play of light and rarity and story. But it is never the whole of it, and that brings us to a final question about blue eyes in particular. If they are a frame, what happens to the painting as the generations turn? Are those pale irises becoming rarer as populations mix and migrate? Or are they simply rearranging themselves, waiting to surprise us in new places, in new combinations? To answer that, we have to leave psychology and return to genetics, to ask what the future holds for a mutation that once sparked in a single pair of eyes and then refused to disappear. If you had stood on a street corner in Northern Europe or North America 100 years ago and simply counted eyes, the world would have looked a little different than it does now. In early 20th century surveys of places like Minnesota or Berlin, more than half the population reported having blue or grey eyes. In some towns, it was closer to 3 out of 4. Old black and white class photos from that era, when colour didn't show but paperwork did, list rows of children whose school records describe pale irises as the unremarkable norm. Now, in those same regions, the numbers have shifted. Modern studies in the United States suggest that where maybe half of adults born in the early 1900s had blue eyes, only a small fraction of young adults do today. In much of Western Europe, the proportion of light eyes is still high by global standards, but lower than it was in their grandparents' or great-grandparents' time. Nothing dramatic, no sudden vanishing, just a slow statistical slide. So what happened? It's tempting to imagine some mysterious environmental change dulling eye colours across the map. Some people even wonder if screens, diet or pollution are darkening eyes. But the explanation is quieter and much more ordinary. It lives in the way genes meet. Blue eyes for most people are the product of a particular version of a gene, an allele, that reduces melanin in the iris. That allele is recessive. To show itself, it usually needs to be present in 2 copies, one from each parent. In a population where most people have that allele twice, blue eyes spread easily. 2 blue-eyed parents almost always have children with light eyes. Even if a few brown-eyed people move in, the recessive version keeps pairing up with itself, generation after generation. Now imagine the last 100 years. Wars end, empires dissolve, planes crisscross the sky. Students, workers, refugees, lovers, whole families move across continents that previous generations never left. A blue-eyed person from Sweden marries a brown-eyed person from Nigeria. A green-eyed woman from Poland has children with a dark-eyed man from India. Their kids and their kids' kids grow up in cities where almost every possible ancestry flows together. In the world, the blue-eye allele doesn't disappear. It just spends more time paired with different partners. If a blue-eyed person has children with a brown-eyed person who doesn't carry the blue variant, all of their children will inherit 1 copy of the blue allele and 1 copy of a brown coding allele. Genetically, they are carriers. Phenotypically, the way they look, their eyes will usually be brown or hazel. Generation by generation, as mixing increases, the chance that 2 carriers of the recessive variant meet and have children with 2 copies of it becomes slightly lower. The allele is still there, tucked away in DNA all over the world. It simply doesn't reach the specific combination it needs as often. This is what population geneticists mean when they say the frequency of a trait can fall even when the underlying allele stays common. From the outside, it looks like a colour fading from the crowd. From the inside, at the level of molecules, nothing is wrong. The book is still on the shelf. It's just not being opened on every page. Because of this, the popular fear that blue eyes are going extinct doesn't really match how evolution works in this case. Extinction, in a strict genetic sense, would mean the relevant allele is being removed from the population, weeded out by selection, cut away by some lethal disadvantage, or accidentally lost in very small groups through drift. That is not what we see. The blue eye variants, especially the well-studied one near the OCA2 and HERC2 genes, do not seem to be dangerous. They are not being systematically purged. They persist at high frequencies in many populations and low but stable frequencies in others. What is changing is the visibility of those alleles. In a more interconnected world, recessive traits of all kinds naturally spend more time hidden, in single copies, inside brown-eyed, green-eyed, or mixed colour-eyed people, rather than flashing themselves in clear blue across the iris. There's a small irony here. For most of human history, people had no way of knowing which recessive alleles they carried. You could guess maybe from your parents or siblings, but if your eyes were brown and your parents were too, you might never suspect that deep in your DNA you held the genetic blueprint for icy blue. Now we can check. Direct-to-consumer genetic tests, those little tubes you spit into and mail away, have made this visible. Some companies include specific markers linked to eye colour in their reports. People open an app and discover that, according to their genome, they carry one blue eye allele and one brown eye allele. They look in the mirror, their eyes are clearly brown, and yet, genetically, they are half of the story that began with that ancient mutation on the shores of the Black Sea. If they have children with another carrier, someone whose own eyes might be dark, that recessive variant can suddenly meet its twin again. A blue-eyed child can be born into a family where no one remembers seeing that colour before. Cases like this show up again and again in ancestry forums and social media posts. Two brown-eyed parents in Brazil or Turkey or the United States share a photo of a baby with unexpectedly pale eyes, and then later a screenshot of their DNA reports showing that yes, both quietly carried the old allele. The colour seemed to skip generations. It didn't. It just waited. All of this means that predicting the fate of blue eyes is less like watching a candle burn down, and more like watching a pattern ripple through a woven cloth as new threads are added. And then there is a new possibility, one that previous generations never had to consider at all. If eye colour is, at its core, a matter of which variants in a handful of genes you carry, what happens when technology gives us the ability to choose those variants? Researchers are already using CRISPR and related tools to correct genes that cause serious diseases in cells, in animals, and, in some controversial cases, in human embryos. Eye colour is a far simpler trait than, say, intelligence or personality. The main molecular levers are relatively well mapped. In theory, a future clinic could offer parents the option to tweak an embryo's iris genes, turn the melanin down, adjust the scattering properties of the stroma, dial in a desired shade. Some kinds of cosmetic eye surgery already exist, procedures that change the colour of the iris in adults, often with significant risk. Genetic alteration would be more fundamental. It would not be a mask or a lens. It would rewrite the instructions from the start. The questions that raises are not really about optics. They're about values. If we normalise choosing eye colour, what other traits begin to seem fair game? Height, body shape, certain facial features. Do we start to converge on a narrow, market-driven ideal of beauty that squeezes out the staggering natural variety evolution has given us? Who gets access to such choices? Just the wealthy at first. Does that create a world where certain aesthetic traits become tied even more tightly to class, region, or power? And what does it mean, on a quieter, more personal level, to look into your child's face and know that some of what you see there was not given by accident or ancestry, but selected from a menu? None of these questions have easy answers. Many countries already have ethical guidelines that sharply limit genetic editing to serious medical conditions, not appearance. Others are still debating where to draw the line. Meanwhile, out in the ordinary world, far from futuristic clinics, the original blue eye mutation continues to do what it has always done: drift, mingle, hide, and occasionally reappear. It started as a single copying error in a single cell in one person, perhaps in a small farming community somewhere near the Black Sea, a few thousand years before the pyramids. It spread through families, through flirtations, through marriages and migrations, through wars and plagues and ordinary Tuesdays. It sat behind the eyes of hunters and chieftains, of servants and sailors, of people whose names history never wrote down. It crossed borders in the gaze of refugees and colonists and travellers who never knew they were carrying anything unusual at all. Now it is written into the genomes of millions who do not show it on their faces. In that sense, the story of blue eyes is still unfolding in real time. Every birth, every partnership between people whose ancestors would never have met reshapes the map of where that old allele lives and how often it gets the chance to speak. It may become rarer in some places, more common in others. It may surprise families on continents where it was once almost unknown. It may, centuries from now, look very different in the global average than it does tonight. But it is not gone. It is not going. It is part of the living tapestry of human variation, a reminder that evolution is not just a saga of the distant past, carved in stone and bone, but a quiet, ongoing process inside each of us. And blue eyes are only one thread. If a single mutation in a single ancestor can reshape the way light moves through the front of the human eye, what other stories are hidden in all the other shades we see every day? What can brown, green, grey, and all the colours in between tell us about where we've come from and where we're going next? That chart was comforting in its simplicity. It was also wrong in its simplicity. When geneticists finally started digging into the DNA behind human eye colour, they didn't find one switch. They found a whole control panel. Yes, the region near the OCA2 and HERC2 genes does a lot of the heavy lifting, especially for the classic brown-blue divide. But sprinkled across the genome are more than a dozen other genes: SLC24A4, TYR, TYRP1, IRF4 and others, each nudging melanin production up or down, shifting how pigment is laid down in layers, altering how light scatters through the stroma of the iris. Add them together, and eye colour stops being a binary choice and becomes a spectrum. Green eyes, for example, are not halfway between blue and brown in any simple sense. They often arise when the main genes that would normally produce a very dark, melanin-rich iris are dialed down, but not all the way off. A modest amount of brown pigment mixes with yellowish lipochrome and the Rayleigh scattering that makes blue, and what reaches the outside observer is a desaturated, mossy or emerald tone. Hazel eyes tend to be even more layered. In many people, they are effectively two eyes in one, a ring of darker brown around the pupil where melanin production is higher, fading into a lighter, greenish or amber outer ring where pigment is sparse and scattering dominates. Different lighting conditions emphasize different layers, which is why hazel eyes can seem to change colour with the weather or the room. Amber eyes are something else again. They are not just light brown. True amber eyes often have a warm honey or copper cast caused by golden pigments in the iris stroma, rather than the deep chocolate of dense melanin. They sit almost halfway to the bright yellow of some animal eyes, a reminder that many of the molecules that colour our own irises are variations on the same biochemical themes used by cats, wolves, and owls. Grey eyes are another quiet oddity. For a long time, they were simply lumped in with blue, but detailed measurements suggest they often involve different scattering properties and subtle differences in how the iris fibres are arranged. In some grey eyes, Melanin is extremely low, as in blue eyes, but the collagen in the stroma is packed or oriented in a way that mutes the bright sky blue and shifts it towards slate, steel, or storm cloud tones. Other genetic variants may influence how much light is absorbed versus reflected at different angles, giving grey eyes that characteristic, almost metallic flatness. None of this can be captured by a single box labeled dominant or recessive. Instead, human eye color behaves like what it is, a polygenic trait. Multiple genes, each with multiple variants, combining in slightly different ways in each person, generation after generation. The result is not a tidy handful of distinct categories, but a continuous field with clusters, brown, hazel, green, grey, blue, and countless subtle shades in between. Sometimes the system becomes even more visibly complex. Every so often you meet someone whose eyes don't match at all. One blue, one brown, one green, one hazel, or a single iris that's mostly one colour with a sharp contrasting wedge or fleck in another. This is heterochromia. At first glance it can look like fantasy or special effects, something a novelist would invent for a mysterious character. In reality, it's a side effect of how cells divide and differentiate. In many cases, heterochromia is caused by genetic mosaicism. Early in embryonic development, a mutation occurs in one cell that will go on to give rise to part of the iris but not the rest. That small population of cells follows a slightly different recipe for pigment production than its neighbours. The result, one section of the iris, or one entire eye, ends up a different colour. In rarer cases, it comes from chimerism, when two embryos, each with their own genome, fuse very early on to form one person. Different patches of the body may carry slightly different genetic blueprints, including the instructions for the eyes. This can produce striking mismatches, not only in iris colour but in skin or hair. Heterochromia can also follow injury or disease. Damage to the structures that control melanin or certain inflammatory conditions can darken or lighten one eye over time. Sometimes this is medically important. Sometimes it's harmless. Either way, it's a visible reminder that eye color is not just a fixed inherited label. It's something living tissue is constantly maintaining and occasionally altering. If you travel far from the familiar pale eye regions of Europe, the story gets even stranger. In the islands of Melanesia, particularly the Solomon Islands, there are communities of people with dark brown skin and naturally blonde hair. Not the sun-bleached blonde of surfers or farmers, but a deep golden blonde that grows in from childhood. For decades, outsiders assumed this came from European ancestry. Sailors, traders, missionaries leaving their genetic signatures behind. But when researchers sequenced the DNA, they found something unexpected. The blonde hair in these populations is mainly associated with a variant in a gene called TYRP1. It is different from the variants linked to blondness in Europeans. In other words, light hair evolved there along a completely separate genetic path. The trait looks the same to a passing eye. At the molecular level, it's a different story. Cases like this are a quiet warning against simplistic maps that tie certain physical traits to races or civilizations. The same visible color can arise from different mutations in different places. The same mutation can spread into very different cultural and historical contexts. Eye color, hair color, skin tone. None of them align neatly with our old rigid categories, and none of them are perfectly static. If you look at family photo albums, you may notice that many babies are born with eyes that seem grey or blue, only to darken over the first few years of life. This isn't an illusion. In newborns, the melanocytes, the cells that manufacture pigment in the iris, are often not fully active yet. Melanin levels are low, so light scatters easily and produces a bluish appearance. As the child grows and the genes that regulate melanin turn on more strongly, pigment accumulates. A toddler who once had pale eyes may end up with hazel, green, or dark brown by preschool. The reverse can happen much later. In older adults, subtle changes in the iris can make eyes appear lighter. Melanin production may decline. The structure of the stroma can shift. Certain medical conditions and medications can darken or lighten the iris as well. Even in the absence of disease, the colour that looks back from the mirror at 70 is not always quite the same as the one that looked out at 18. So when we talk about my eye colour as if it's a permanent simple attribute, we're compressing a lot of moving pieces into one phrase. Genes, development, age, health, and chance are all in there, woven together. Step back even further, and the picture widens again. Every shade you see in the human iris, brown, green, hazel, amber, grey, blue, and every in between, is the visible edge of an invisible history. Each colour is what happens when strands of DNA, carried through ice ages and droughts, invasions and migrations, meet in one particular combination in one particular person. The green eyes of a child in Brazil might be a conversation between Iberian fishermen, West African traders, and indigenous ancestors who followed the rivers long before any ships arrived. The dark eyes of a woman in Sweden might quietly harbour recessive alleles for blue or grey, inherited from long ago farmers on the Black Sea steppe. The amber eyes of a man in the Solomon share deep biochemical roots with wolves and eagles, even as the specific mutation that lightened his hair arose independently in his island ancestors. None of us chose these patterns. We inherited them, along with the stories they carry, stories of survival through bottlenecks, of small groups wandering into new lands, of communities meeting, mixing, sometimes fighting, sometimes falling in love. If you could trace the path of the alleles that determine your eye colour backwards, through your parents, your grandparents, their grandparents, and on, you would walk the migration routes of continents. You would pass through ancient villages, cross lost shorelines, watch ice sheets advance and retreat. You would meet Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia, see the first small bands of Homo sapiens leaving Africa with dark, melanin-rich eyes that had been tuned by millions of years under the sun. By the time you came back to the present and looked into a single pair of eyes, your own or someone else's, you might never see them as just brown or blue again. Every time you meet someone's gaze across a table, on a train, in a faded photograph, you're looking at a living fossil of sorts, a tiny shimmering window where physics, genetics, geography and history all intersect. Behind the colour you see are thousands of generations who lived long enough to pass their genes on. Wars survived, winters endured, bonds formed around campfires, in marketplaces, under city lights, chance encounters that led to children and children's children, until, finally,